Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Science for Communities lecture series from the Chesapeake Biological Lab. For those of you who've never joined us before, my name is Tom Miller, and I have the honor and privilege of being the 6th director of the Chesapeake Biological Lab, part of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. The University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science has a unique legislative mission to conduct research on any aspect of the environment that affects the citizens of Maryland or helps inform people who make decisions on our behalf. And it is in support of that mission that CBL is committed to engaging with the communities that surround us to let them know what we do and why it's important. We've been doing these seminars now for about a decade. We do 5 in the spring and 5 in the autumn. Like many other aspects of life, we closed down briefly during the beginning of the pandemic, but for the last 3 series, we've done these lectures over Zoom. We certainly miss the sense of community that develops by having members of the public in our seminar room, but we've also been able to reach more people, and we often find members of the community joining from across the nation. We've had people join from California and Florida and Georgia. And so we have to find some shred of hope in the darkness that was the pandemic. So tonight marks the halfway point in our seminar series. We've had 3 so far. We have 3 more to go. And this evening's seminar is being presented by one of our esteemed colleagues, Dr. Jackie Grebmeier. Before I formally introduce Jackie, just a reminder that next week we will have another Science for Community lectures. Dr. Libby Jewett, who works for the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration, will be talking about how the International Panel on Climate Change reports, the IPCC reports, are put together and give us a view behind the veil, so to speak, on how all of that science is assembled, reviewed, evaluated, and synthesized to provide the kind of first-class advice that the IPCC are known for. And then 2 weeks from tonight, CBL's own Slava Lubčić will give a presentation on how banking and insurance industries use information about climate change to make decisions about risk and ultimately insurance rates when they are insuring large portfolios of investments. So we hope that these presentations will round out our series on climate change. All of these seminars, the 6th in this series and all of the prior seminars, are recorded on our website. And if you go to www.umcs.edu and search for Science for Community, you'll be taken to the page and you can find all of our previous presentations. And so turning to tonight, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jackie Grebmeier. Jackie got graduate degrees on the West Coast, including at UC Davis, at Stanford, and ultimately at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where she began her work on studying the Arctic at a time when concerns over climate change were only really beginning to be realized, but those concerns were very evident already to the people in the Arctic. Following her graduate work, Jackie moved to Tennessee for a period of years, spending 20 years at the University of Tennessee, before joining CBL in 2008, and she's been with us now for 12 years. During that time, Jackie has conducted groundbreaking research with her research partner and husband, Dr. Lee Cooper, and numerous collaborators and students. I will note that we'll be celebrating the PhD defense of one of those students tomorrow, and if you're interested in attending that, please get in touch with us and we'll be able to send a link. In this time, she's received funding from a number of high-profile national science organizations, including NSF, National Science Foundation, and NOAA. and has received awards both from our own president. In 2016, she was awarded of the President's Award for the Application of Science. And then in 2019, she was recognized as a fellow of the American Association for Science. And tonight, she's going to be integrating and synthesizing much of her recent work, looking at how climate change is affecting the diverse biological and ecological systems in the Arctic. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Jackie Grebmeier. Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Bring that up. All right. I want to thank you all for joining in this evening, and I'd like to go ahead and begin the presentation on climate warming and the changes that we're seeing in the marine ecosystem in the Arctic, especially the Pacific Arctic, where I've been spending the last 35 years. I collaborate with many people in UMCES as well as across the US and internationally, and I just name a few here. Lee, was Tom already mentioned. We have a colleague doing the satellite observation and a marine mammal specialist. But it's really a consortium of many scientists in order to understand this system. So as a brief outline, what I'm going to cover today, and I'll set my alarm so I don't take too long, is to look at the importance of the Pacific sector. And just to orient you, I'm pointing my arrow here in Alaska, on the side that where the arrow is, and a very narrow strait, Bering Strait, and this is Russia and Siberia. Our largest, one of our largest fisheries is in the southern Bering Sea. And then what you're looking at here are currents, very cold, nutrient-rich water that comes from the deep Bering, which eventually comes from the deep, coming in from the Pacific, and then going into the western side of the Chukchi Sea. And then on the other side are some currents that are moving for the fresh water that are coming in from the rivers and the glaciers along Alaska. So what I'm looking at is that we've been seeing in the last decade declining sea ice and warming of ocean seawaters. One of the things I'll be showing you are the time series of macrofauna. These are animals such as clams, worms, that are important prey actually, and crustaceans, small shrimp-like organisms, for some of the biggest animals that we have, some of these big marine mammals that are in the region. So we look at these time series, they are integrators over the years. We also look at sediments and we look at hotspots. So this region, because of all the arrows, you can see there's evection of carbon into the system. And an important point that I want to, to talk about, it's my daughter, is the development of the Distributed Biological Observatory, which has been a consortium of both national and international scientists since 2010. So if you look at the system, I'm pointing out in the upper part is the annual sea ice persistence. That means how long the sea ice is staying in the region, comes in during the late fall into the winter time, expands down through Bering Strait into the Bering Sea. And the bright red colors that you're seeing means that the trends are in the down. So there's less sea ice, it's leaving later, pulling back later in the season and expanding. And then it's going to, it's pulling back earlier in the season and going back into the north late into the fall. And if you look on the right-hand side, in just the last 20 years, that bright red is the decreasing sea ice cover. And it's really dramatic, and the trends were less than 50, lost about 50 or 60 days worth of sea ice timing to make that ice. And the importance of the ice is it rejects salt, and that salt helps transport various carbon and components into the Arctic. On the lower left is the temperature. So these are sea surface temperature anomalies. And what I would like to point out is how bright red you're seeing here, especially in the last difference between 219 and 218. The red colors are up to 5 degrees more than normal in the Chukchi Sea, and that is helping facilitate melting the ice as it goes northward. If you look at the composite here is basically 3 decades worth of macrofauna. And these are the animals that you're seeing at the lower right. They have clams, which are important for walruses, as well as diving sea ducks. We have amphipods that are important for whales such as the gray whales that come up from Baja, California. And then some of the marine worms that you see that are actually fed upon by walruses, as well as all this, the bivalves. So what you're seeing are footprints of the dominant taxa. They're the families of our groups of classes of animals. So we have the browns, which are actually the bivalves. These are the clams. The pink color are crustaceans, such as these amphipods. And in the background, you're seeing these high biomass areas. So these animals, the big upper trophic organisms and diving sea ducks, come into this region to feed upon the very shallow 30, 40, 50 meter depth water in this region. But I'd like to also point out the yellows. These are the marine worms that people think, oh, they're worms, but they're quite nutritious for big animals in high concentrations. So these are the ones that the upper trophic levels that I'm speaking about. They are the ones that the gray whales, we've seen a shift in their distribution. They're not ice loving, unlike the bowhead whales that we might have heard about. These gray whales, they come and they feed off of bottom organisms or layers of krill. They're actually near the bottom, and their distribution has shifted because without the ice further north, they're actually moving north, and they opportunistically are feeding in euphausids, and they're also staying longer in the northern part of the US Arctic. The walruses have been losing sea ice platform and it's important for them in the lower right because they use this for riding on, so they don't have to extend energy. They rest on it. They nurse their calves because the moms and the calves go into the Chukchi Sea because of the rich benthic animals they can feed upon. And another benthivore or benthic organism are these diving sea ducks. They also are impacted by the change in the sea ice platform to be able to rest, and they do their breeding up in that area and feed on these clams. So in the process of the last, as we were moving through the 90s, actually, and doing so, we started seeing the changes in some of the key components, be it temperature and salinity, food for the marine animals on the sediment, in the sediments, as well as in the water column. So a consortium we built with the National Science Foundation and National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, along with many other of the agencies. You can see their logos on the lower part, such as NASA doing satellite observation, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, looking with the oil development that's occurred in the region to look at what is the status and change of that ecosystem. So we as a consortium of scientists and with managers looked at what some core measurements, for example, temperature and salinity, chlorophyll, nutrients, all of these were being collected by different ships. So we agreed to sample along these transect lines and to share those data, which is what we do. We look at the plankton. So these are like the small animals in the water column. We looked at animals that live in the sediments. So not only their size, how much they weigh and who's there. At the same time, we have seabird and marine mammal observations, fisheries acoustics, and periodically on trawling. So this is the oceanographic part, and that you can see the study area coming from the south, from the Bering Sea, all the way over actually into Canada through our international collaborations. But at the same time as the ships are sampling, we have gliders. These are autonomous vehicles that are sailing, that are inside the water and actually manned by in the lower 48. There are moorings at some of these sites, particularly at site 1, 3, and 4. And then we work with the satellite observations. But the important point I think also to say is that there are many agencies funding scientists that have other goals in here, but they agree to sample and share data when they go across these lines. And they're built on these areas where we see a high rate of change, either in biomass, biodiversity, or in overall productivity. And I would point out that with this, it's not only the national, but we have international collaborators from China, Japan, Korea, periodically from Russia and Canada. So for the first example, I'd like to show you, these are diving sea ducks. These are spectacled eiders. They dive, here they are in the springtime when the ice is still there. The males are the white ones that you're seeing. The darker ones are the females. This is where they meet in the open water. They do their mating behaviors, and then they're diving down to feed on very rich clams on the bottom of the ocean because it's very shallow, a shallow water system. So these animals are very much influenced in the springtime by the open water as well as the food on the bottom. And lately, in the last 10 years, we are seeing ocean acidification potential increasing because of increasing CO2 that have the ability to dissolve some of these clamshells. And the important point that you're seeing here by this bright purple here is this is very cold water. So these animals come here, the animals that live on the bottom are not impacted by cold, they're adapted to that cold water. It's when the waters warm up that they're having issues, and I'll show you some of that. But the big point here is that traditionally this would keep out the commercial fish that would come from the south and would be able to come and feed on a lot of the benthic animals on the bottom or in the water column. But these are kept south until recently. And the ability of these fish to come northward also means commercial fisheries can move northward. And then we have the competition between local subsistence hunters that are living on the coastline here, marine mammals that migrate 3,000 to 4,000 miles to feed, and commercial fishing. So as an example in this area south of St. Lawrence Island, what you're seeing here is the average. The sea ice normally goes away in May and June. It's open water till October and November, starts to build up about December. But you'll notice the red and the golden covered colors here. That's because in 2018 and 19, we had a decline and reduction of sea ice because the water was so warm and the weather was such that the ice did not build, and we were down to only having 30 days of ice. On the right, you'll see that traditionally, and it's in April and May as the sea ice starts to retreat here, that we would have the beginnings of an ice edge bloom. But in that 2018 period, we actually had the bloom later in the season and a lot lower because there was no sea ice present. So that gives you an indication that the importance of sea ice is it starts the spring bloom, you get hit with ice algae that goes settling to the underlying sediments, and then you proceed to get open water blooms after that. So it's a really important, tracking this change is quite dramatic in the northern Bering Sea. As an example, we as oceanographers, when we go out, and you can see this warm bullet, this is on one of the lines here where we have our time series. This is St. Lawrence Island, Russia, US, and very warm water, up to 11 degrees on the surface. And then we've already passed the spring bloom or even the open water bloom. It's settled down, you can see it about 35-meter depth, about 100 feet. And this is where the oxygen rates are the highest. So when you have a primary production going on, you build up the oxygen in the water. And so as you're moving north, you see this in the summertime. So it sets up the organic matter to be able to settle down to feed these animals on the bottom. What we're seeing over time, and this is from 2000 to 2015, is a decline and these are primarily clams, which are the purple color you're seeing here, and the sky blue ones are the polychaetes. So on these stations that are in the southern part of the region here, we're having declines in the clams. This is the important food for those diving sea ducks. And in fact, we have an increase of the polychaetes or the marine worms, which can be food for pollock and for Pacific cod if they're moving into the area. And it's only there's a northern contraction, and you can see the higher amount of this purple color, which are the clams in that region. So as Tom mentioned, Christina Gaithel is going to do her defense tomorrow morning. I put the link here, but you can contact either Tom or Sarah or myself, and we can send you that link. And you can see what she's seen in her observations is the biomass of these specific dominant clams that are the dash lines of the food that normally would be food for the diving sea ducks. And then these are the Macoma calcarea, which is another species that have come into, have been in the region, but really this area from 2000 to 2008 have been the primary food for the diving ducks because they can only fit a certain side down their throat. So it's the 18 to 24 millimeter, basically a half of an inch that can actually get down into down to their crop. Back now into 2019 and 2018, when that sea ice disappeared to almost only 30 days instead of 150, what happened is you can see the encroachment. These are Bering Sea Pacific cod, and these are Bering Sea pollock. These are two commercial fisheries in the southern Bering Sea. And what you're seeing here is in the blue, as you march through to 10 to 12 to 17 to 18 and 19, you can see them moving into the northern Bering Sea because there's no longer the cold pool to keep them out. The same thing can be seen with the pollock distribution. You can see this, the temperature is retracting, it's getting warmer, the cold pool is declining, and you can see the movement of this Bering Sea pollock. We were out in the field last October, and we could see the long line for fisheries, particularly for the Pacific cod. And on the Russian side, up in the through Bering Strait, they have a commercial fisheries beginning in that area. If you move in north of St. Lawrence Island, this is the traditional area where you would have gray whales feeding. And I would just point out, we see this rapid decline that happened after about 2015, 16, 17. And you can see that the decline was such that the concentration was much lower, and it was delayed freeze up and early breakup. And that's what that figure is showing you. Again, you can see now we're there, same time, a couple of days later in July 2019, we see this is standard on these lines, very warm again at 11 degrees Celsius on the surface water. And at this point, it was on the surface. You see the oxygen levels, and the fluorescent was over in the offshore sites here. And this is very high primary production going on that then so we hit a bloom at that time that could provide food from the underlying sediments. However, what we're seeing on our decadal time series is actually a contraction, because as this warm water moves northward, these animals are adapted to be in cold water. And you see this going through the 80s into the 90s, and we actually are starting to see changes to polychaetes here on the western side of the system. So this is the prey patch of the gray whales. They come up, they're still feeding there, but they're primarily doing it in the northern part, and they're spending more time going and trying to find food, either these small crustaceans that you're seeing here that are small shrimp-like, or they're actually, like I mentioned earlier, feeding in the krill. But it's this contraction of the northern part of these high biomass areas is also what we saw south of St. Lawrence Island. And we're starting to see that as we go through Bering Strait. So not only are you changing the amount of food in the cafeteria for big animals to use, you're changing the amount that's there. So one example of this change is this is a sculpin in the center, very used by local community when they fish for these. This is the polychaete that I'm speaking about that has taken over, and this is under one fish. There are over 40 of these type of species of worms. And so we're seeing a shift of the dominance. That's more that the winners are going to be the fisheries. The losers will be some of the bigger upper trophic whales and seals that utilize particularly some of the amphipods that are in that area, because they want that lipid rich component, and they're not able to filter out these large worms. So if we move north now through Bering Strait, you see here Russia and the US. And again, whoops, you see that warm water in the areas here in the surface. The salinity, you're looking at the higher salinity offshore. This is water coming in from the Russian side through Bering Strait, nutrient-rich, colder water. But you can see that we're having, although we have oxygen on the surface, it started to settle out. This is the previous, before we got there in July, settling out of that spring bloom into the bottom water. And this is the fluorescent. It's still viable, though, if there's enough light for it to continue to grow, which makes this a very productive area. So if you look at this particular situation, because the open water is expanding in this area, at the time you have high nutrients coming through, you have the sea ice pulling back, you still have cold water on this side. We have a lot of productivity going on in the summer period. And the result of that is you're seeing this major increase in the biomass of some of these regions, from particularly here, what we call UTN, up in the outer side. And these are all dominated by the clams, which are important food, particularly for the walruses that are feeding in that area. So if you look at the 3 time series sites that I've been discussing, this is just a summary. What we're seeing are the declines in the biomass, which gives you an indication how much food is there for upper trophic animals, whales, walruses, even fish. And we see them declining in the southern part of the system here. Similarly, we have some of the decline occurring in the what we call DBO2, and this major increase in the northern part of the system, we're having a lot of the organic matter accumulating, because not only is production going on in the water column, it's like a conveyor belt. So if you get on a conveyor belt at a shopping mall, you move forward, and that's what's happening. A lot of the organic matter is being carried in the currents, and if they slow down, they dump carbon, but a lot of it is going through the system and then going down to the underlying sediments north of Bering Strait. We did, as the ice has been pulling back, we've been building a new observing lines up in the northern part of the Chukchi Sea. And so this is an area I would just show you here, up here, the DBO4. This is up in the northeast Chukchi Sea. And what we see there, by the time we get there in July, a lot of the carbon is settling down. This is again at about the 35, 40 meter depth. You can see oxygen all across where we've had these time series. So we can track what happens when we have different ships. We can compare these data, but there are also moorings. There's something called the Chukchi Ecosystem Observatory that has moorings and is putting in a new camera system and all that, this to look at temperature and salinity and nutrients on this site. So that's what we'd like to do, is to have some of these moorings that give you a time series throughout the year, and then link it up with these slices of data collections that we do on the vessels. As an example, what you're seeing here is this is the highest macrofaunal abundance. And I want to point out that abundance, you can see this bright red color here. It's in this south, what we call Hannah Shoal here. It's southwest of Hannah Shoal. But I would point out, by the time you look at the biomass, that most of the animals are tiny. And so even though there's some pockets of a higher biomass, there's nowhere near what we have in this DBO3 line. It's half the quantity. But that's because this area has traditionally been covered with ice for a longer period of time. And what we're starting to see is an increase pullback of sea ice in the summertime, and an increase in production in that water. So tomorrow, as I mentioned, the Chukchi Ecosystem Observatory, I just would point out Catherine Lalonde will give a seminar tomorrow afternoon that's available if you just get a hold of us at 3:30, and she'll give a presentation on just the sediment trap from the moorings, not just at the region in the northeast Chukchi Sea, but also in the other DBO sites down in the northern Bering and in the Chukchi Sea, as part of various programs that she's been involved with. But the main thing, what sediment traps provide you here is a look at the overall this is now September, October, November, December. We're normally out of the field. It's beginning ice cover right now in November. We'll start building ice up. In January and February will be the maximum ice coverage on here. And then we would go into spring and then into summer. And I just want to point out, summer is the brighter green color, that's chlorophyll. So this is the phytoplankton, that's the food for animals that live in the water column, as well as that settles down and feeds the animals in the underlying sediments, which are then the prey for bigger animals. But I'll bring you back into the fall, because that's where we are now. And you'll notice there's a lot of zooplankton in that water column. The ice has not come back yet. A lot of the chlorophyll is settling down to the bottom, but this is when the growth period is going on. The zooplankton are consuming any of the available organic matter. They're also releasing eggs into the water. And so this region you would not know all of this activity was going on if you weren't able to see this through a time series observation. And so that's what I'm outlining below, and Catherine will spend more time on it tomorrow. But basically, you go from late summer to fall, you still have open water, a lot of chlorophyll on the bottom, high zooplankton, food for the benthos. Winter, figured right here, you see it's covered with ice, but you still have life going on. There's lower plankton, but there's a resuspension going on. The benthic animals are still able to feed on that resuspended or buried carbon. You move into spring, the snow melts from the top of the ice, more light comes through, you get production under the water, and then that can be deposited to the benthos, and you start getting into the life cycles of the copepods. And then in the summer, you have full high production because the ice is gone, and really tight pelagic benthic coupling in some of these high hotspot areas. So what are we finding out? Some of the activities that are going on now, or some of the findings, is starting in 2019, there was a gray whale die-off along the whole coast from Mexico to Alaska. And you can see the colors from 2019 compared to the average here. And these are strandings, and these type of studies were declared an unusual mortality event. And the importance of this is that it's something that is then looked at along the coastline to determine what is causing this. Is this due to changes in prey, which we're finding, in fact, as you go north, or is it due to changes in currents or warming water or more predation? And so there are committees looking at, it's not as bad this year, but the committees are still on to involved now to look at what are those key drivers for the deaths of the gray whales. The other thing that happened, and you got to realize this all happened about 2019. There were unusual mortality event for ice seals, and that was bearded, ring, and spotted seals. These are classic Arctic seals, and that they would increase mortality 5 times compared to normal. And the question is still, is this because of food, lack of food, or is it because of some type of pollutant coming into the region? And you can see also seabirds, and it was across various types of seabirds in 2019. There's still various seabirds washing up on the coastline, being looked at by both local communities, collections, and being passed on to Fish and Wildlife of what is causing some of these high mortalities of seabirds. But we're having big trophic organisms, whales, seals, and seabirds being impacted, and the question is why? And one of the things that in the last few years have been looking at are the environmental stressors that are occurring in the region. And this is Christina, who will talk about this, not about acidification, but we'll talk about her clam research tomorrow, is that what impact that can have, because it can dissolve the shell components of some clams, but not necessarily others. So there's going to be winners and losers for the acidification. And we're getting that in over the winter time when there's a lot of organic matter going down to the sediments. You're taking up, utilizing oxygen, and CO2 is being released, and that drives the acidification level and acidity of that water down. So it becomes corrosive. And what you're seeing here is our observing line in DBO4 and 5. And that's exactly in this region here where a lot of organic matter settles out. And there's where there's high bivalve biomass. And the key feeder on that area are these Pacific walrus that utilize this region. It's the last ice coverage up in this northeast for them to feed on. There's a big bivalve community that they can feed upon, but they're having to potential for the impact of stressors in the region. Another one are the harmful algal blooms, and I'm sure many of you have heard about that in temperate areas. They get it in the Gulf and in the Atlantic, but we've been seeing these increasing in the Pacific Arctic because of the declining sea ice. There's more sunlight, and with more sunlight, and there's also warmer water. These are all attributes that can enhance the growth of these components of these dinoflagellates. So one of the things that Don Anderson, I'll show you a few slides out of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute with a consortium of folks, including our team here who collected sediments and animals for a recent paper in a study, is that there are actually hotspots of where these cysts go in, and they cyst down these dinoflagellates, and they are making very large seed beds. And this came with our Japanese colleagues who first saw this in 2013. If you look at what just came out in this 2021 paper, the dinoflagellate is an Alexandrium cantonella. It's toxic. It forms a cyst when after it grows, and then we found it in surface sediments, the highest that have been found compared to any other place in the U.S. And this came about, and he also observed blooms. So there are other people on the ship collecting water samples, and they're actually blooming conditions because of the warmer water and the fact that the dinoflagellates were there. And why is this important? Because with red tides, they can be above toxicity levels. We're seeing that in some of the clams. Now, clams, like we were mentioning earlier, they are able to feed out of the water column, but they also feed on surface sediments. So they're ingesting, and they're in these hotspot areas. We've seen them all the way up the line, particularly in this area where there's an overlying bloom, but also in the northeast. And then last year we saw them in north of Bering Strait. So just to come to a conclusion on this, we are seeing major ecological shifts, and that's and this was a projection that came out that Lee and his colleagues put together, Lee Cooper, in 2019, on the expected impacts with reduced sea ice conditions. So what you're seeing is a conceptual model, and in fact, we're actually testing these aspects because this is part of what we're seeing. If you look at this as being the way it would be normally back in the 80s and early 90s, you had a CO2 level, say 350 parts per million. We had sea ice present from November to June. We had obligate, what we call species that require sea ice, like the walrus I mentioned before, bowhead whales that stay north, that feed on high krill loads up in the Arctic, especially off of the northwest part of Alaska. So you have these polar bears feeding on they feed on the ring seals underneath the ice. And the benthic production has traditionally always been higher than the water column production, because a lot of that cold, that organic matter would settle out both from the early season to the open water to the underlying sediments, because the zooplankton are delayed in their growth. They're usually in the late and the summer and into the early fall, when they're actually at their highest levels to crop organic matter. But based on this conceptual models, and we are seeing these parts of this, is that now with the higher CO2, which we passed, there's greater than 400, less ice volume. We're seeing that the ice is going out and staying out later. It's not coming back. It's coming back later, and it's going out in the fall, and it comes back and it builds in the winter time, and then it's leaving earlier. That is an earlier melt, later ice return. And what this shows is that then you have less of this ice algal production going on. You do open up the water for open water production, but it's the timing of when that happens. That's going to be winters, such as the killer whales that are coming into the Arctic now and feeding on gray whales, actually, that are feeding on some of the underlying the krill or in the sediments. So what we're seeing now is that more of seasonal migrants. And if you see this on the news, for example, gray whales are traditionally, they come in, but they really don't like ice, and they head out back to warmer waters. They're staying longer now. You also have these fin whales that are traditionally subarctic ones, minke whales, humpback whales that form the bubble nets, and the killer whales. So all of these subarctic type species are moving into the system, as are these fisheries that are being pointed out here. So this was the idea, the conceptual model, and that we're starting to see is the water column production becoming potentially on the extreme greater than what we could see in the benthic production. So whereas some of the benthic feeders, such as the gray whales or the walruses, will have a negative impact, some of the fisheries and some of these upper trophic level killer whales and some of the species may well be more dominant in that region. So I'd like to just conclude with that, those statements and that summary that I just made, because it pretty well outlines the changes that we're seeing in the warming of seawater, the pullback of sea ice, the changes in the timing of the productive water, which is important because the animals are set to come in to utilize this food at certain times, and then that time period is actually changing. So I just want to say that I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. And I list some of I can't put all the names on here for our collaborators, but we wouldn't have this program without all the field scientists and technicians and the people the captains and the crews of the ship. And then I just outlined some of our core funding for the Arctic work that we do in our research lab at CBL. So thank you.
Jackie, thank you very, very much. I always enjoy when you give presentations. Your enthusiasm for the work that you do shines through. I omitted to mention when I introduced Jackie that because this is run as a Zoom conference and not a Zoom meeting, we cannot unmute you to ask questions. So I encourage you to ask questions in the chat box, such as Peter Markham's, do you need volunteers? But while people are thinking of your questions, I wonder, Jackie, whether you would just reflect on the importance of long time series of observations, because they clearly played an important role in the stories you've told tonight.
That's right. I think that without the time series, we would just have the snapshots. And in fact, when I started my career, I had a 3-year study, right, for my PhD, and everything looked like it was standard. But then I started going back to those same sites and had the opportunity as the ice pulled back to work in that area. And it's only because of this. We have the longest time series of environmental and benthic data in the Arctic because we were able to keep that going. And now we're building that up, being able to show the changes in temperature. We've got satellite observation, satellite scientists working with physical oceanographers and chemical oceanographers. So building time series means you need to also work with a lot of different disciplines. And I'm sold on the time series. We have a 35-year time series, and we can start seeing these changes that you might not see if you only took 3 or 4 years, which is often what you get in science.
I think that's undoubtedly true. So we'll go to some of the questions. So John Roberts asked, any thoughts about climate change on the land, specifically sort of late fall and winter rains, preventing caribou and other larger animals from eating?
Yeah.
So you told, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was going to say, because there's a whole suite of scientists exactly that do the terrestrial component, but I do know, because we're working on the edges of the ocean onto the land, the permafrost is melting. And so that's bringing some pretty old carbon into the nearshore coastal zone. But as far as the terrestrial, the timing, it's drying up in certain areas. So these animals that migrate thousands of miles on the land, particularly like the caribou, they go there for having their young and also for bulking and then also for breeding. And if they can't get across because the rivers are, we are seeing more rainfall, and that means that there's more fresh water going into the river systems that they have to cross, that there are definite impact where some areas are drier. And so so when they're looking for food, it's not in the same place. So it really impacts their migration. The timing, once again, it's the timing of those biological events driven by physical changes that have a major impact on these larger animals.
Thank you. But one of the reasons I like these seminars is that we always get such great questions. And here's one from Ted Karski. And he said, in your seminar, you've documented winners and losers with climate change. So how do we define what's good or bad?
That's a great question, because that brings in societal issues for that. Because the big animal, I can talk about worms and clams and I get excited all about it. But the public are most interested to see what has happened to the iconic polar bears or the larger whales that are feeding, that will not make it through these major changes. But you're right, we'll have killer whales that could move up there, but they're eventually they're not going to have any prey to eat. So there's a cascading effect that can go on here. But it is a value judgment. I mean, right now, is it more valuable to keep the animals that are traditionally traveling 3,000 to 4,000 miles, or to have these pollock going up there so we can have a big commercial fisheries for 2 months of the year? Right now, there's not enough for the US, but they're long lining on that. But you have, the big thing too, is you have people there, and the people traditionally who live along the coast, the indigenous populations, and the Alaskan people that have been there for decades, they utilize the marine system for their livelihood. And the animals that they're using are different than necessarily the other ones that are offshore. For example, bowhead is just an iconic traditional animal. And walruses are their bread and butter. It's their hamburger for us, for going for a hamburger, hot dog. For them, those walruses, they take them through the winter because they don't have the same type of access to grocery stores as we have. So, but society is going to have to make some influence on this, because you're going to have to make decisions on climate change. Otherwise, right now, the only reason we don't have oil development in the Northeast Chukchi Sea, we were out there when Shell was there, is because it wasn't economically viable at that time. And the oil wasn't there, but they are working in the Beaufort. So it's, then there's a trade-off. You get the societal rules in there, the policies, the management, the environmental, is there a way to find a compromise on that, or is there a need on certain things that need to be fully protected or not?
Great, thank you, Jackie. So another advantage of these systems, if it's the same Sam McClatchy who I knew 30 years ago, having curries with him in Halifax, Nova Scotia, whom when I last heard was in New Zealand. If it is the same Sam McClatchy, good evening, Sam, or good morning to you. Sam's question is, how important do you think changes in food quality, as opposed to just the amount of food, is with regard to the mortality events that you talked about for marine mammals and seabirds?
Right, and it is extreme. Quality is extremely important. I mean, did have a graduate student work for me who looked at caloric content and on the clams, and certain species will provide for this. For example, a diving sea duck, it goes down for 50 meters in the water column and it's going to gobble whatever clam is down there. The clams that are there now aren't necessarily as caloric rich as the ones that were there before, so they're getting less bang for their buck. It's the same thing with gray whales, is that there are patches of high crustaceans, small amphipods and so forth on the area they're migrating, but the caloric content, the quality of the food isn't as good. So you're getting a hamburger versus a steak, a hot dog versus that. And it is extremely important because the Arctic is known for very fatty, lipid-rich, long-lived animals. And so if you don't have a prey base that has that rich lipid, because some of the clams don't have that, some of the amphipods, then that gray whale, for example, is feeding at the same energy exertion, but not getting as much caloric input. So it can have quite a dramatic change. So if you get temperate species moving into the fat that are not as nutrient rich, taking over where you're going to have Arctic species that have a lot of fat, you can see what the difference is. They're gonna dive down and they're just not gonna get as many calories. And that will have a big impact.
Great, thank you. So from potentially a friend in New Zealand to someone much more local, Ted Turner notes what a tremendous amount of information there was in your seminar to take on board. And you clearly documented in the seminar and in the answers to the questions this evening, shifts in both migratory and indigenous animal populations and in the human communities that rely on these changes. And Ted asks, do you think this is an irreversible snowball, perhaps an apt metaphor? So is this a one-way change, or are there countervailing processes, either natural or human-induced, that could be brought to bear to slow, change the direction or stem the degree of change that we're seeing?
That's a really good question. And I think there is, because of the big drivers are the CO2 or methane releases that are all have their greenhouse gases that are causing things to be warmer anyway. So if there's a limitation on that in the atmosphere, but we've already set the stage on some of this, it's already out there. And so, but can we bring it down to the other side of the curve? And the answer is, if we have environmentally sound climate control, incentives to make it more business capable to do that, I think we can have an impact. Whether it'll go back to the was in the 1970s, I don't think so. Can we get it to the point where we stabilize it? I think I'm optimistic about that. But it's not something, if we let it go another 10, 20, 30 years, you're going to be able to turn it back, because there is a certain baked in already. So we do need to make some decisions on how important it is to slow things and maybe stabilize versus just letting them go to complete open water. Because right now the projected open water in the summertime in the Arctic to the North Pole in the 2040. So you can see right now we have commercial vessels, we have icebreaker LNG, we have fishing vessels, we have military vessels, all going into the high Arctic, based on, a lot of it has to do with military, but economic issues. So then you need an economic incentive, and it'd be better if we could work together than to have competition. But I think right now, if we could work together at the private sector, we probably have a chance to help this.
Thank you. So DCD, I'm not sure quite what that stands for, but DCD says, it seems to be a very sad story. Is it hard to keep optimistic in your work? I would say, in answer to the questions, you've demonstrated both a tremendous passion and enthusiasm and in the answer to that last question, some degree of optimism for our ability to control the system.
Well, I do. I think that, it's like mentioning the harmful algal blooms, they probably have been there, they just aren't in the sense periodically when the water warmed up and they're sitting in the sediments. But that they're periodically going to be causing blooms. But I guess I'm an optimistic at heart. I think that we need to understand what's happening, and then we're going to have winners and losers. There'll be certain animals that can actually be more resilient, ones that are actually up there. Some of them are capable of withstanding ocean acidification, and they are, if they're able to grow more and still have the great caloric content that the walruses can feed on, then we have a stability in there. And it's that resilience part of it. So I am cautiously optimistic, but I guess the thing is I am built that way. But I think put our heads in the sand and not do anything to keep either track of it or make societal decisions, I think would be wrong. So.
Okay, thank you. We'll take a couple of more questions before we'll let Jackie go. So Kalina, and I'm afraid Kalina, your last name is cut off on the chat box. So Kalina asks, you mentioned about built-in change. So what's the delay in the system in the Arctic in response to, say, carbon emissions? Right, there's a lot of focus in society at the moment about carbon capture and slowing down the release of carbons. Mm-hmm. So how long would that, if we were able to stop it today, for example, what's the time lag before those things are observed in the high Arctic ecosystem?
That's a really good question, because these animals that I was talking about are anywhere 10 to 50 years old, the ones, the benthic animals, and some of these bowheads are living to be 100. So they have gone through these, they're going through these changes now. So to give you a time, I can't really give you a timeline except to say we lost a lot of ice in 18 and 19 in the northern Bering Sea. And everybody was looking at the dramatic changes, and I continue to do that. But our ice has come back. It's still not fully back. It's going to be thin, and it goes back, which means it'll go back faster. It'll grow, and then it'll retreat faster on that. So you're looking probably, if I can't imagine we would turn everything off at the gas pump right now. So I think that you're looking probably in, I'd say, a decade or two, if you could see something, but if we don't, I think we're already saying if we get to 2 degrees Celsius change, we'll tip the ice out. We've lost nearly 70% of the multi-year ice in the high Arctic. So that's our refrigerator. I'm talking about the North Pole into the Deep Basin. Our weather patterns are driven and climate by, it's warm at the tropics and it's cold at the poles, and you get all these Hadley cells and atmospheric. If you don't have that gradient difference, instead of being like this, it's actually like that. You have, you have global climate issues. So that's how long it would take to do that. The ocean has been taking up heat for a long, long time. And I think it's still capable of doing that, but we just can't assume that it's going to do it all the amount of time. So if I was to speculate, I'd say if we were to start putting controls in now, we'd see something within the decade.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And then you could prove me wrong.
Let's hope we do that experiment, right? Let's hope we do the experiment. So John Roberts has been asking some questions. I'm going to try and capture a couple of the questions that he's asked in one. And that is that the sort of ice shelf habitat that you've described is really unique for polar environments. You focused on some of the really charismatic species. What about other species to which this is useful? Perhaps, Greenland shark or narwhal or other animals that we should have on our radar screen as being affected by these changes.
Right, and I think they will be. The Greenland shark, I mean, I don't know a lot of this, the hearsay, but if these animals, they grow slow and they grow in cold waters. And so if your cold waters are warming up, that's going to enhance their metabolism. And if they don't get the commensurate amount of food to kind of keep them at the same level, there is a limit to what these animals can tolerate with the temperature, which is why some of the losers are going to be in my system that I study, the benthic animals. There's certain ones that just can't take that heat even on the bottom. So I would say, and then the narwhals, you know, they're, you know, what are they preying upon? You know, they're preying, I believe, on fish. And so they're dependent on that. And so, you know, what kind of fish are they going to be as nutritious? Are they lipid? That will impact both of those organisms. So I think you do have to keep, I focused in on the animals on the Pacific sector, but underneath all those, we got little zooplanktons and changing the biodiversity changes are going on. We're starting to see that will change the functioning of a system. But the bottom line is that, yeah, you need to, if I was in the Eastern Arctic, I'd be talking about Greenland sharks and narwhals.
Yeah, I think what is remarkable to me when I hear you and your collaborators speak is this idea that philanthropists are spending vast amount of money to get people to the edge of space. Yeah. And yet there is so much of our planet that is completely unknown, particularly the deep oceans and the inaccessible oceans that have traditionally been inaccessible, in your case, because of ice cover, that we have such a poor understanding of how these systems function and possibly how much we even rely on these systems without really knowing it. And you've made mentions of some of those things about the heat that the ocean absorbs, the carbon that the oceans absorbs, the production that comes from these high Arctic systems that as then migratory animals move that production south. It would be wonderful to think of investments in understanding Arctic and deep ocean systems better, because they really are poorly understood. With that, Jackie, on behalf of everybody else, I want to thank you very, very much for a wonderful presentation. For those of you who've attended this seminar, you will recognize the enthusiasm and passion that Jackie brings to her work and to the advocacy for her work at national and international organizations. I think one of the most impressive parts of Jackie and her collaborators' career is their willingness to engage with the local indigenous Alaskan communities, to explain their work, to help understand that work and what it means for them. And it really is, I think, an exemplar of what an academic should do. So on behalf of everyone, Jackie, thank you very, very much for an inspiring presentation. And to those who are still with us, a reminder, we've got 2 more seminars to come in this series, and you'll be hearing from us by email. Jackie, once again, thank you very much. And to everyone, have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.